It's Thursday, the 24th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Chief Whip Wendy Morton, Shadow Justice Minister Ellie Reeves, The Guardian's political editor Pippa Crerar, and author and Financial Times journalist Sebastian Payne. Today, turn down the heating to save pounds and Ukraine.
It is a national mission to make sure that we can't be blackmailed by people like Putin.
The government campaign to get us all to save energy this winter.
Students and staff, unite and fight!
Lecturers, postal workers and teachers are all out on strike today. On Saturday, it's the rail workers. Whose job is it to get the country back to work?
Everybody in the industry knows what to do to resolve this dispute.
It's the employers and the unions who need to hammer out the detail. It's not the Transport Secretary's job.
Yet more bullying allegations emerge against Dominic Raab. Can the embattled Deputy Prime Minister survive? And remember this?
I'm not entirely clear on what the situation is with the Chief Whip. There has been an element of confusion over whether the vote was a confidence vote or not.
Our guest, Wendy Morton, tells us what really happened on the night that spelled the end for Liz Truss. Let's start the programme with this tweet from the BBC's Home editor, Mark Easton. Net migration to the UK in the year to June is estimated at more than 500,000, 504,000, the highest figure ever seen. And this is demonstrated clearly on a graph by the Office for National Statistics, which shows, as you can see there, total long-term net migration, that steep climb there, the green line, and that the vast majority of that is from outside of the EU. My opening question to you, I'm going to start with you, Ellie, is 504,000 as a net migration figure too high?
Well, the government have completely failed to meet any of their own targets in relation to this, and the system is a complete mess.
But is it too high? Is the figure too high?
Well, the problem is none of it's connected to skills. So actually, what I would like to see, what Labour would like to see, is a system in place, a point system that is fully connected to the skills that we don't have, but also making sure that we have the skills of this country.
You'd have 500,000 skilled people coming here.
Well, what I think we need to do is look at where there are skill shortages, make sure that at home we are training up the workforce to meet those skills, but also then looking at who has the skills abroad that could come over. But none of that's happening in the system at the moment. We've got the government's completely lost control over who is coming over here, and when they're here, visas not being processed, asylum applications not being processed. It's a mess. It's a shambles.
And too high?
Those figures are pretty shocking, yes.
Are they too high or too low?
Look, we continue to work to get a grip on these figures. We have the Rwanda policy, which is really important, the work that the Home Secretary is doing.
Right, but Wendy, 504,000 from a government that says it wants to bring numbers down overall. It pledged to do so in the 2019 manifesto. We've had Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, say she'd like to get it down to under 100,000. That's gone, hasn't it?
And absolutely, we continue to work to get the migration figures down. But I think what you have to also recognise is that, you know, what is going on in Europe and outside of Europe, and the factors that are actually driving migration. You know, and I believe a big part of this is going back upstream to tackle some of those factors. This is not just a phenomenon that's happening in the UK. It's happening in many other countries, in Greece, Spain, and across Europe.
And you're right. They break down the figures for us. Yes, it is down to influx of people from Ukraine, from Hong Kong, a higher number of international students. But overall, will you admit now, these are record figures, that the Conservatives have lost control of immigration?
What I will say is we have to continue to work really hard on driving these numbers down and understanding, as I said, what the factors for
They're going up. They're not
the
going
drive
down.
and tackling at source, and making sure that our processes are working as good and efficiently as they should be.
Have they been up until now?
I would say that there is room for improvement.
Right, OK, maybe the understatement of the year. Only by your own metrics, this. Richard Tice, it does have political consequences. He is the head of the Reform Party. He tweets, Brexit betrayal. Only Reform Party will control our borders, both legal and illegal. Plus 509,000. That's the number of people coming in. It's slightly lower when you take the figures of people leaving the UK. Estimated net migration of non-EU nationals in the year June 2022. Do you agree it's a Brexit betrayal? You worried by this sort of tweet?
I don't believe it's a Brexit betrayal. Like I said, we have to continue to work on this and look at the drivers for migration, and make sure that we are tackling those drivers and processing those claims that come into the UK, but also distinguishing between asylum and illegal migration and legal migration.
Give us some of the context to this. I set out and suggested some of the things that have been said by the government. I mean, how important is this issue politically and those figures?
Well, I think we've seen in recent days the way that immigration generally has dominated the headlines. At the CBI earlier this week, both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer setting out different party policies on it, how important it is. And it depends which section of the population you're looking at, but given that so much of the focus seems to be on the swing voters in the so-called red seats, immigration is still one of the most important issues for them. Across the country generally, it's fallen down the list of issues actually in terms of post-Brexit, in terms of what people are most worried about. And this particular set of figures, I think what the government probably will be saying is breaking it down and saying, look, half of them are from those three refugee streams, Ukraine, Afghanistan and Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong's not refugees, but, the British overseas nationals. And trying to sort of justify them in that regard. But they're so far off the headlines that they wanted to see in terms of numbers that it will be damaging for them with that group of voters.
We are in this situation where the politics and the economics are completely out of sync with each other. That the big story from the UK jobs market is skill shortages. And if you speak to any businesses, and we saw this at the CBI conference this week, they are desperate for more migration. They want to open up more routes for that. But politically, that Richard Tice tweet that you mentioned earlier speaks to the issue for the government that within Downing Street, they know that if Nigel Farage was to come back, if the Reform Party got even 5 or 6% in a general election, that's it for the Conservatives. They take off enough votes to allow Labour to pick up many more seats. So this is why when Rishi Sunak spoke at the CBI conference, all he talked about was small boats. Now, that does matter to a lot of voters, of course, but it's not what businesses want. It's not what the economy wants. So we're in this sort of situation, this is true for Labour as well, that they are very keen to try and win back some of those red wall seats where people are still concerned about migration more than in other parts of the country. So all the politics are get migration down. Everything the economy wants is in the opposite direction. So every time we see these headlines, it just speaks to the kind of sort of stalemate we've got, and it's not really good or working for anyone.
Let's talk about energy, because the government, we're told, is preparing a £25 million information campaign, which will see celebrities and ministers on the airwaves, online, encouraging people to reduce their energy usage. Some suggestions in the Times today about having fewer baths and more showers, turning down your thermostat. Is this campaign necessary, Wendy?
Well, look, I've not seen the details of this campaign. I think it's yet to be confirmed. I think, yes, it's important that we make sure that residents, that constituents and businesses know what support is out there, absolutely. And it's one thing to give people maybe tips on how to save energy, because that helps our energy here. It helps bills, what people are paying. But equally, I don't think it's for government. I'm not going to be telling my constituents how often they should have a bath or have a shower. I think there's a balance that I hope we see.
Because just to show you this headline from last month in The Telegraph, this was when Liz Truss was still Prime Minister, Downing Street blocks energy-saving information campaign. The £15 million campaign would have encouraged households to consume less energy amid energy supply fears. So was that correct, or is the government launching a slightly more expensive campaign correct?
Well, it's certainly a more expensive campaign. Let's see what the detail is. But there are two angles to this. One is, as I said, by us using slightly less energy where we can as individual consumers.
Sure, but should the government be
on our own bills?
Yeah, but should the government be telling people?
And government should be telling people where the schemes are to help people through the winter with their energy bills, and we've done a huge amount of work on that. But when it comes to actual practical things, I would say most people can make up their own minds and make their own judgment as to how and when to save energy.
Will this
work?
Common
sense.
Well, will it work, this campaign?
I mean, we need to see the detail of it. It's a hugely expensive campaign by the looks of things. It is sensible to tell people how they might be able to save energy. But let's not forget that we're in this mess because for the last 12 years that the government's been in office, they haven't tackled energy security. So there hasn't been the investment in renewables. They've closed the gas storage facility
But the war in Ukraine is probably the real driver, isn't it?
But we are over-reliant on gas and oil from abroad because we haven't had that investment at home in renewables.
Well, Seb, and I'll come back to you, Wendy.
Wendy, on that point, though, this campaign's, we're talking about £25 million. There are billions and billions being spent on this energy support package. The cumulative effect of millions of people across the country trying to save a bit of energy, that will save the government billions in the long run. And I understand your ideological aversion, the sort of the nanny state of telling people what to do about when to take baths or put on a jumper. But if you don't do that, it's just going to cost more money to the taxpayer in terms of those huge support packages, which, as we know, led to the kind of the financial disaster we saw after the mini budget.
Look, as I made clear, I mean, giving people information of where there are benefits available to them to help their energy bills is absolutely the right thing to do. Some advice, yes, but I think when it comes down to we're not living in the nanny state here. I think let's treat people respectfully. They can make their choices. They can make common sense. Let's see what the detail is on the scheme and the package that comes out. But I think fundamentally here, though, we all have a part to play, do we not? And that is that if we all use a bit of energy less, it does help on terms of our dependency. But yes, it does help on our own personal bills. But if I said to my constituents, stop, wearing your shorts in the house when the heating's full on, I can imagine what they would say to me. This is called common sense.
Right. Is there a quid pro quo, though, Ellie, in this?
Well, look, I think that the government could have done a lot more to support people.
Sure, but about this campaign, I mean, is it going to make people change their habits? Are they going to do the right thing, as Wendy's been saying? Or is it, as Seb said, look, people should be told if they're getting a support package?
I think some of it is just common sense.
Yeah.
And I don't think the government would be spending millions of... I hope the government's not spending millions of pounds on telling people not to wear shorts and put the heating on. But there are some other practical issues around, for example, turning radiators off in rooms that aren't being used.
But would Labour have a campaign like this in this situation, do you think?
Under Labour, we wouldn't get in this situation in the first place.
Of course.
They're reliant.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, it does feel that we're slightly behind other countries on this. France and Germany have both had campaigns in place for several months. We could already have been in a position where we'd saved the taxpayer money, ultimately, given the scale of the energy bailout. Their reasons were actually quite different. It wasn't just about, the emphasis here is about cost of living and saving money. There, it was about sort of a patriotic responsibility not to rely on imports of Russian gas and fuel, with the added benefit of course, saving money.
Because after April 2024, we know from the Chancellor that we're going to be on our own. I mean, hopefully the price of gas will have come down.
And if they haven't, then I think maybe the government will rethink. So
yeah, and that is in the future. It is, of course, also at the same time that we've heard about the new energy price cap from Ofgem. This will be from next year. It's going to be higher, obviously, than we thought.
Yes, and I mean, people will see those kind of headlines and feel a huge amount of worry. And I think that the energy package that was introduced in September, which is obviously being modified by the new Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, people think their bills are being capped at £2,500. They are not. And I think that when people see their bills this winter and then they see what's coming next year, it's going to be a lot of worry. And I think the government needs to communicate better to people what this energy support package is doing and where the support for the poorest households is, because there is a lot of money being thrown at this, billions of pounds, but I think for the communication it's not been very good at all, in my view.
I mean, do you think that could be improved? And also, have you changed your habits? Have you turned the heating down, or rather not had it on at all until recently?
I suppose, like many people, I do try and keep the heating down as low as possible. I probably am in that space of putting the extra jumper on. But look, the point here is information to constituents, it's information to the members of the public. And so we haven't seen the detail yet of this campaign that's coming out. But I think a key part of this for me is making sure that we give those people that want the information, we make it as clear as possible as to the huge amount of the package that the government is putting in to help.
Is that clear at the moment, do you think?
I think the more that we do, the better to communicate. It always worries me as a constituency MP, do my constituents really understand what support is there available for them and where to go and get it?
Last week in Parliament, I raised the case of an elderly lady who was admitted to hospital with a temperature of 26 degrees and she died shortly after. She couldn't afford to heat her home. This information campaign isn't going to do anything to help people like her who simply cannot afford to heat their homes. And I want to be hearing more from the government about what support there will be for people like her, that, you know, it's not about turning the thermostat down a couple of degrees. Actually, they can't turn it on at all.
Well, and that's true, isn't it?
Well, look, and I think that the point here is that the information getting out to people is so important. I can't comment on that specific
But there'll be a lot of
case,
people probably in that situation.
You know, I don't think we should underestimate the big package that the government has put in place. It was the right thing to do, but the information out there to people is a key part of this. So let's see what this campaign comes forward with. I think we'll all be watching it very carefully.
Let's talk about strikes, because the first major wave of winter strikes is happening today, with lecturers, postal workers and teachers on strike. Tens of thousands of staff at 150 universities across Britain, including lecturers, have walked out, causing disruption for students up to 3 days. Schools in Scotland have been forced to close in the first national teachers' strike since the 1980s. 115,000 workers at Royal Mail are also out on a 48-hour strike, which could hit Black Friday shopping deliveries. Now, at the very moment we're on air, Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, is meeting Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT, to discuss the continuing train strikes. We're hoping to get a statement, or at least turn that around for you, from Mick Lynch before the end of the programme. But in the meantime, whose responsibility is it to solve or stop these strikes?
In terms of, I guess you look at me, Jo.
Yes.
In terms of the trains, it's the negotiations are between the train operators and the unions.
Right.
And that's where the negotiations are. And I think it's really disappointing that we find ourselves again in this situation, facing strikes around Christmas, strikes that, you know, affect people trying to get to work, people trying to go about meeting family for Christmas. But it's absolutely between the train operating companies and the unions.
So why is the Transport Secretary meeting Mick Lynch then?
Well, I don't see the agenda, but I imagine because it's important that he has a discussion and a conversation with them. But that when it comes to the actual negotiations, it's between train operators and unions.
Could any government, Ellie, give the unions what they're demanding?
This government doesn't seem to even be trying to get around the table.
Any government. Could any government give exactly what the RMT is demanding in order to call off the strikes?
I want to see them get around the negotiating table, and that hasn't happened. We've had 3 different transport secretaries in 2 months. They're only meeting today, and the Transport Secretary has said that he's not even negotiating today, so it doesn't even sound like he's going into this meeting in good faith. The government has got to get the parties round the table. The government needs to broker a deal. We didn't see these sorts of strikes under the last Labour government, and we've got a Conservative government that doesn't seem to want to speak to the trade unions to try and get a resolution. No one takes the decision to strike lightly.
Let's be quite honest here, that in previous governments, Labour governments, ministers did not take part in those negotiations. It's always between the operators and the unions. I think what's also important to recognise here is during the pandemic, we, the government, the country, subsidised the railway industry, the trains, to I think £16 billion. It was the right thing to do. But we are where we are today. We also need to see some modernisation and some reform to make sure that our railways are fit for the purpose moving forward.
Let's talk to Kate Bell, Head of Economics and Employment Rights at the TUC, Trades Union Congress. Hello to you, Kate. Lecturers, postal workers and teachers, as we have been saying, are all out on strike today. There are train strikes tomorrow, many more strikes in prospect over the winter. We're going to hear from the nurses about their decision. Why are they happening?
Well, I think we've had 12 years of a pay squeeze. It's the longest pay squeeze we've seen for 200 years. Workers missing out on about £20,000 on average cumulatively, compared to if pay had just kept up with inflation. And I don't think people can really take it anymore. And I think the common factor is these are people who've tried to get around the negotiating table. They've tried to say, you know, we need that pay rise. We can't cope with inflation at 11% without a bit more money in our pockets. Unfortunately, those negotiations haven't produced results. And they've taken the difficult decision for those workers to go on strike.
Can anyone solve the problem of strikes?
Well, I think government could be playing a much more constructive role. You know, we've seen pay restraint right across the public sector. That's not all of those strikes, but it's many of them. As you were just hearing, it is, of course, the government who signs off on the ultimate deal between the train operators and the unions. And, you know, they could have been playing a role to step in and get that sorted out. We've seen no evidence of that happening. And I think what we need is a government with a strategy to get pay rising, because a decent pay settlement is what these workers are asking for.
17% was the figure, I think, that was being demanded or asked for by nurses. Do you think that's reasonable, that sort of demand? Inflation is running at 10%. They're talking about pensions and benefits being uprated in line with 10%. 17% is far higher.
Well, inflation is 11.1% in the last figures. I think what people are looking for is a government and negotiations that recognise the huge pressure that people are under. You know, we've got nurses going to food banks right now. That is a horrific sign of the state of our country, and at the same time some people are getting very big pay rises. You know, we've seen the average increase in bankers' bonuses last year at £5,000. I think, you know, some people are getting those big pay rises, and I think what people are saying, whether they're nurses, rail workers, postal workers, is they cannot go on like they have, with constantly being asked to accept real terms pay cuts.
Kate Bell, thank you very much. Seb, listening to that, a pay squeeze for over a decade, but many people will say those sorts of rises being asked for are unaffordable. And yet, if you've got pensions and benefits rising in line with inflation, at the time I think it was just over 10%, then, you know, who's right here?
Well, the answer is obviously sort of everyone's got a point in.
Yes.
There's no easy way forward. If there was, the government would have solved it, or the unions would have solved it. The only real way through this is to tackle inflation, is to get inflation down, so that cost of living squeeze is reduced. And the government would say it's doing that through Jeremy Hunt's budget and their plans to try and stabilise the finances. But the fact is, we're going to see more and more of these strikes. It's not going to end this winter. It's going to keep on running. And the more that keeps happening, the more the political pressure will grow. And I think, you know, I think Ellie does have a point that we've had a lot of transport secretaries who've all come in with slightly different tones and approaches. You had Grant Shapps, who I don't think had a particularly productive working relationship with Mick Lynch of the RMT.
I don't think they met, or he didn't want to meet.
I don't think they met. Then you had Anne-Marie Trevelyan came in very briefly under Liz Truss's government. She tried to be more emollient. And then you've had Mark Harper, who again is trying to do the same thing as well. And the real question is, Mick Lynch has become, you know, a fantastic figurehead for the trade union movement and very popular on social media. What we don't know is what he's saying behind closed doors, because in public he's talking about these huge figures which are simply never going to happen and would lead to a wage price spiral. But when he's sitting down with Mark Harper and with the train companies, is he actually being more realistic? Because you've actually seen that with a lot of the other unions.
Yeah, yes. I mean, what about public support, Pippa, for these strikes?
Well, I think because the people that are striking, or indeed taking ballot action to strike, are also members of the public. You know, there are people that work in the NHS, the people that work in universities, the people that work in schools. And like every other member of the public, they're feeling the cost of living squeeze as well. Their salaries aren't going as far as they might have done previously because of the rate of inflation, and they have public sector workers have had real terms pay cuts going back the best part of a decade. So some of them are in a worse off position than they were 10 years ago. So I think on that regard, there's a lot of public sympathy. I think what will be interesting to see is the tipping point when people feel that their own services are affected. Now, that's most obvious, I think, with the trains, when people start feeling that their commutes to work is going to be disrupted, or they're not going to be able to go and see their families in Glasgow or Lancashire or wherever else for Christmas. And then, of course, the NHS, and if there's strikes with nursing and auxiliary staff in the NHS, and that could potentially have a really serious impact on people's health. So I think at the moment there's a huge public sympathy for people who are experiencing the same cost of living pressures that they are, but it might tip if people feel that the services that they rely on aren't being delivered.
And I feel like that tipping point, you know, the fact the RMT is going on strike over Christmas, you know, again, politically I can see why they've done it, but it's going to annoy an awful lot of people. And essentially the key 2 weeks when everyone's trying to move around the country is going to be the point when the services are disrupted. And then when we get to January, as you mentioned, the NHS, Pippa, that's going to be a huge issue as well as the flu season really starts to get going. But I think the unions know that. And I think, for example, we've got at the moment some very savvy union leaders who have played it quite well. And they've always settled, I think, at quite a substantial increase, but it's not where inflation is at.
I mean, Mick Lynch criticises the government and blames them squarely for not having resolved this issue. But he also says and blames the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, for being, as he described it, too vanilla when it comes to rows between business and their staff. I think he's sitting on the fence on a lot of these issues. Should Keir Starmer come out squarely and support the strikes or condemn them?
Well, we support the right to strike, and I don't think
that
anyone...
I know.
I don't think anyone takes the decision to strike lightly. Workers don't get paid when they're out on strike. And we think we should get round the negotiation table to stop them from having to strike in the first place. But, you know, we do understand that these are working people who are also affected by the cost of living crisis. Now, I was contacted by a teacher a couple of weeks ago who said, you know, her fixed rate mortgage was going to go up by £750 a month. You know, they are being squeezed by cost of living and inflation, just like everyone else. So I think there is public
But
sympathy.
is there leadership from Keir Starmer? Is it fair for Mick Lynch to say he's been vanilla on this?
I don't think that is fair. And actually, if you listen to the General Secretary of Unison, what she says is that the best thing for her members will be getting a Labour government in place so that we have better workplace rights and protections. And that's what we think would be best for working people.
Let's just hear a little bit of Mick Lynch in his statement.
So we've just had a meeting with Mark Harper and his team. I would say it was a positive meeting in the sense that we've got rid of the bellicose nonsense that we used to have from Grant Shapps and his cohort in his era, and we're now starting to get a dialogue.
Ah, well, bellicose nonsense has gone of Grant Shapps. What do you make of that?
Well, interesting is, given that I was a former rail minister myself under when Grant was Transport Secretary. Look, I think it is welcome news if there are discussions ongoing. Yeah. The key thing I would say here is that the negotiations need to continue.
Right. Or is the key thing here the right Transport Minister to actually hold those negotiations? He says it's more positive.
Well, we will wait and see, won't we? But I think what we need is the negotiations to continue, to people to stay around the table and to hopefully find that deal that is fair to the people that work in the rail industry, but equally it has to be affordable to the
What is that? Just what is that then? Because let's say 10.1% is the amount state pensions and benefits are going to be uprated to next year. Why shouldn't public sector workers ask for the same or more?
Look, it's not for me to sit here and dictate what the negotiations would be. I'm not in the room. I'm not the negotiator. It's between the train operating companies and the unions to negotiate that.
Yeah, sure, but broad principles. I mean, that's a benchmark. Should public sector workers get that, or should politicians like you, Ellie, or you, Wendy, say, no, I'm afraid, yes, we'll increase wages, but it's going to be a real terms cut?
Well, look, I think we have to see where the negotiations get to.
But what do you feel?
Because actually, we have to come to a place where it is affordable.
Right, but what is affordable? That's what I'm trying to get to.
To the country and to the taxpayers.
Is that below or above?
When there are plenty of people who are not in these sectors, in the private sector, who I'm sure will not be getting 10, 11% or 17%. But coming back to the railways, you know, we do need to see some reform as well alongside this package that is clearly being discussed.
What's affordable, Ellie?
Look, I mean, I'm not round the table, and so you know, we have for the train operators and the unions and the government to broker a deal. That's what isn't happening at the moment. Public sector pay has been squeezed. The cost of living is going up. Private sector pay is increasing at a much higher rate than public sector
so you think
pay.
maybe
and these
10%
things need to be taken into account in any deal.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens, of course, with those strikes. Let's talk about the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab. Two formal complaints have been made against him and his behaviour during his time as Justice Secretary and Foreign Secretary. He was at the dispatch box representing Rishi Sunak for the government, if you remember, last week at Prime Minister's Questions. Just before he went into the chamber, he requested an investigation into his own behaviour and those complaints from Rishi Sunak, which is now ongoing, which has now just started, actually. He denies all the claims and any allegations of bullying and says he'll thoroughly rebut or refute any claims made. We're joined now by Newsnight's political editor Nick Watt, who actually has news on fresh complaints of bullying against Dominic Raab. What have you found out?
Well, Joe, there are two elements to this. In the first part, we have learnt on Newsnight that several civil servants, these are private secretaries who work incredibly closely with Secretary of States, with ministers. They sort of run their diary, they run their day, that they are lodging, planning to launch, in some cases have already launched complaints about bullying, alleging bullying by Dominic Raab. The way that this works, if you want to do this as a civil servant, is you have to lodge the complaint with your department. These relate to previous incarnations as a minister by Dominic Raab, before he was reappointed to the cabinet by Rishi Sunak last month. You make the complaint to your department, and we understand that the Ministry of Justice, where he's back as Secretary of State, their HR department has been inundated with complaints. The second area is over the use of private emails. Complaints, warnings to Dominic Raab when he was a minister that he was using private email for government use, and that is not allowed except in some limited circumstances. I should say, Joe, on these 2 points, Dominic Raab has always said that he has acted with honesty, with integrity and professionalism. Yes, he likes to drive people hard, but he never acts as a bully. And on the use of private email, yes, that was done for things like approving tweets, but it was absolutely not done in the way that it shouldn't be done. And interestingly, on that, in the last hour or so, the Downing Street lobby briefing, they have said that they are not going to be investigating that use of private email. They think it was covered by that sort of opt-out in the ministerial code on that.
How much did Rishi Sunak know about these complaints, formal or otherwise, and how damaging is it to him, do you think?
Well, on our show Newsnight last night, Dave Penman, who's the General Secretary of the First Division Association, that's for the top civil servants, he said that before Rishi Sunak appointed Dominic Raab last month, the Prime Minister was told about unease over Dominic Raab's behaviour when he was previously a minister. Crucial thing is, at that point, there were no formal complaints. And I think the view in Downing Street is you can be told there are concerns, but that's not the same as a formal complaint.
Yes.
Those formal complaints only came in the last week. How damaging for Rishi Sunak? Well, Dominic Raab was really the one senior Tory who stood by him absolutely at every stage during that leadership contest over the summer. And if he knew there was unease, might be difficult, but as we say, it wasn't formal complaints at that stage.
Nick Watt, thank you very much. Wendy, you worked with Dominic Raab in the Foreign Office from 2020 to last year. Did you know about any of these allegations or complaints?
I was not aware of any of them at all.
Right, and what's he like to work with?
Dominic has a unique style, but we all have our own style.
A unique style? Is that a euphemism for something else, Wendy?
But no, I've had, I can't say that I was aware of any of those complaints at all.
I mean, that sort of behaviour, I mean, it's right, it's being investigated. He's called for it to be investigated. Does that mean that none of these allegations or any of these allegations surprise you?
No, what it says to me is that there is an ongoing investigation that the Prime Minister has set up. I think it's Adam Tolley who is leading it. I think it's important, actually, that we allow that investigation to continue and that those cases that have come forward are looked at in the proper way, and that hopefully as soon as possible the investigation is concluded and then it moves forward from there.
Right, you do of course have direct experience yourself of being at the receiving end of certainly very aggressive, rude texts that we have shown on the programme before. This was when you were Chief Whip and they were from the former Education Secretary Gavin Williamson. We can take a look. As I say, we have shown them to our viewers. It's very clear how you are going to treat a number of us, which is very stupid, and you are showing all interest in pulling things together. Don't both asking anything from me. This is to do with not being invited to the Queen's funeral. He goes on to say, also, this shows exactly how you have rigged it. It's disgusting. You're using her death to punish people who are just supportive. Absolutely disgusting. And then you say, Gavin, again, this is not the case whatsoever. How did you feel when you got those texts?
I think, to be honest, Jo, it would be wrong of me to comment on those texts because there is an ongoing investigation underway. So I appreciate you probably want to hear my views, but
I do.
It would, at this moment in time, it just wouldn't be appropriate.
Do you think do you think the way that you were addressed is appropriate? Do you think that's how people should talk to each other?
What I would say is that, you know, I'm a member of Parliament. Ellie's a member of Parliament. We employ staff. We work in. It's a huge privilege to be a member of Parliament, and I think just like in any other workplace, you know, I would expect us all to hold one another in respect, and you know, I want to see Parliament actually restore some integrity into the whole of the organisation. You know, it's not just MPs. We employ staff. There are all the people that work on the estate as well, which actually is why I know that Speaker Lindsay Hoyle has set up a conference to look at some of this. And I think it's right and proper that we do. Things have changed over the years.
Sure, but is that typical of the way MPs message each other?
Well, certainly not when I'm messaging colleagues, no.
No, it's not typical of what you would receive normally from MPs, even when you were Chief Whip.
You know, like I said, I'm not commenting on
I know, but is that...
But absolutely not.
Right. Has he apologised?
I'm not going to comment anything more on it, Jo. I'm sorry.
I mean, I don't think that would have any bearing on any complaints process. But has he talked to you? Have you had any contact, or has he said sorry?
I've not. He has not spoken to me.
What did you think when the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, because he resigned and the resignation was accepted, and he said words to the effect of he was sorry to lose Gavin Williamson as a minister?
That was the Prime Minister's decision to say that. Like I said, I just think it would be really wrong of me to get drawn into this debate at this stage. What I really want is just for the case to be concluded, and then we can go for that. Then I'm more than happy to have a conversation about it. But at this moment in time, it would be wrong of me to say anything.
We'll definitely get you back on when this has been resolved. What do you think, Seb?
I think the Prime Minister's putting an awful lot of political capital into trying to save Dominic Raab, and you mentioned why. He, you know, in those dog days of August when it was clear Liz Truss was going to win, everyone went off on holiday, including Matt Hancock, I think. Dominic Raab was one of the only people who kept going out and defending Rishi Sunak. That's why he feels he's now got to save him. But as these complaints stack up, it's going to get more and more painful for the Prime Minister. And it feels to me as if Downing Street has made the decision, we are going to save him. Because if they weren't, he would have resigned in the same way that Gavin Williamson did. So they're doing this inquiry led by a senior barrister who will be looking into all these. And you can imagine at the end of it, there'll be some kind of apology, you know, some sort of maybe in a management awareness course or whatever it may be. But I think for a lot of civil servants, certainly the ones I've spoken to about this, they do not feel that this process has been managed well at all, and they do not feel he should really been brought back to the Ministry of Justice, given that I think this was very widely known within the department, within his private office, and by the senior civil servants who ran the department.
Yeah, we first broke the story about complaints about, informal complaints at that point, now formal, about Dominic Raab's alleged behaviour a couple of weeks ago, and been following it very closely since then. And one thing which has become really obvious to me is that Rishi Sunak's pledge when he took over, and oft repeated since, that he was going to oversee a government that would embody integrity, professionalism and transparency at every level, is now a problem for him. Because if you find any minister does not reach that standard, that bar, then you could quite justifiably turn around, and civil servants feel this, and say, well, you know, they've met that target, that level, and therefore you need to do something about it.
Do you think he'll survive, Dominic Raab?
We will have to wait and see. But I think the point about restoring standards and integrity in Parliament is such an important one.
It is. So you're not confident he'll survive?
That's not what I'm saying. I said I'm not going to prejudge. Let's wait and see.
All right.
Somebody else is doing that investigation, not me.
He made that comment to try and distance himself from Boris Johnson, but in fact it's become quite like John Major's back to basics.
Absolutely.
And every single thing, it becomes a Christmas tree you can hang things off.
Well, Rishi Sunak is the third Conservative Prime Minister this year. There has been something of permanent turmoil under successive governments. Liz Truss's government, Wendy Morton served there, lasted fewer than 50 days. Seb, you've just written a book about the last days of Boris Johnson. Of course, you've got it here. And I suppose the question is, what does it mean for the next general election? Will voters forgive and forget? The polls have consistently put Labour ahead. Let's just remind people how Boris Johnson's premiership ended.
Is it all over, Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister constantly tries to deflect from the issue, always tries to blame other people for mistakes, and that at least nothing left for him to do other than to take responsibility and resign.
Today I ask him to do the honourable thing, to put the interests of the nation before his own interests, and before, in his own words, it does become impossible for government to do its job.
Does the Prime Minister think there are any circumstances in which he should resign?
Have the Tories lost the next general election, Seb?
It's going to be very difficult. It was already going to be difficult, having a fifth successive victory. But Boris Johnson was so personally responsible for that 29 victory, winning all those post-industrial Labour heartlands together. And I think the biggest problem is going to be what happened to the Liz Truss government, because obviously Rishi Sunak wants to get as far away from that as possible and have a very different message. But that voting coalition, I think a lot of voters who were very pro-Boris Johnson still don't quite understand why he went in some respects, because it was a very Westminster story, and as I chart in the new book, it was a 9-month story that really started with the Owen Paterson saga, the former Environment Secretary, and there were 3 Ps to it. There was obviously Paterson, there was Partygate and Pippa's amazing reporting on that, and then of course the Chris Pincher affair. And people will remember those specifics the next election, but they will remember it's not Boris Johnson, they will remember Liz Truss's disastrous budget, and they will remember essentially a whole Parliament of complete turmoil.
It's time to talk to you, Wendy Morton, about your time as Chief Whip, particularly the night, that key night of what turned into a confidence issue, as many Conservative MPs saw it. You were said to have resigned that night and then unresigned. Let's just have a listen to one Tory MP first, Charles Walker, about what he thought was going on.
What I understand is that we were on a confidence vote, which means if you voted against your government, you'd lose the whip, because in essence you were saying you had no confidence in the government. Then at the dispatch box, in the wind-up, the minister said it wasn't a confidence vote, which created chaos in the division lobbies. This whole affair is inexcusable. It is a pitiful reflection on the Conservative Parliamentary Party at every level. And it reflects really badly, obviously, on the government of the day.
Do you think there's any coming back from this?
I don't think so.
He was a bit of a broken man that night. Were you a broken woman?
It was one of those nights that I will probably never forget, and afterwards I spent a lot of time reflecting on it. But the fundamental thing here is it was a confidence vote. It was really important that we won that vote, otherwise the opposition would have taken control of the order paper on that following that. And so that's why I took the stance that I did as Chief Whip, that it was confidence vote. We were expecting people colleagues to be in the lobby with us, and so so when the exchange across the dispatch box came that it wasn't, you can see what ensued, which was chaos.
And you resigned and unresigned? The Prime Minister was chasing after you, begging you not to resign?
I offered my resignation on the basis that Number 10 were interfering, and I feel so strongly about the integrity of the Chief Whip and the red lines that I have. But the Prime Minister would not accept my resignation, so I continued.
How difficult was that exchange?
It was, well, as you would I expect, it was robust, but it was respectful. I do respect Liz, but it was a conversation that we needed to have.
Have you spoken to her since?
I have, yes.
And
several times. I had coffee with her just the other week.
Did you?
Yes.
And how are relations?
We can sit. They're fine, actually. Look, she had a really turbulent time in office. However, you look at it, and then it wasn't just that evening of the fracking vote. From the minute she was elected, we straight away went into the demise of the Queen and the funeral, and then everything that flowed from that. You know, it's important in politics that you continue to have the relationships with the people that you work with. They are colleagues and friends at the end of the day. So, yeah, we had a good cup of coffee recently.
I think we all need a cup of coffee after hearing about all of that. Thank you to all of my guests today. I will be back with Politics UK tomorrow at 12:45 on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.